She was in the bathroom, looking in the mirror, when she saw it for the first time. A deep wrinkle around her eyes that hadn't been there the week before. At that very moment, something inside her broke irreversibly. In a matter of months, a 15-year marriage had turned into wreckage, the children were traumatized, and an entire family was torn apart. But the scariest part of all? She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. There's a silent phenomenon happening right under our noses. Women who seem balanced, devoted mothers, exemplary wives, suddenly turn into true emotional hurricanes around the age of 40. They abandon everything they've built, destroy decades-long relationships, and leave behind a trail of emotional devastation that affects entire generations. What you're about to discover will completely change your view of female psychology and relationships. Because there is an emotional time bomb hidden inside millions of women, programmed to explode precisely at this age. And when it does, nothing remains intact. Why exactly 40 years old? What's so special about this age that turns completely normal women into agents of family destruction? For decades, psychologists and sociologists have tried to understand this devastating pattern. Why do women who dedicated 20 years of their lives to family suddenly wake up one day and decide to throw it all away? Why does the rate of divorce initiated by women skyrocket precisely at this age range? And why, even knowing the terrible consequences for their children, do they move forward with decisions that seem completely irrational? The answer lies buried deep in the female psyche, mixed with cruel social pressures and a biological reality that no one wants to admit. We're talking about an explosive cocktail of free-falling hormones, plummeting self-esteem, and a distorted perception of reality that turns women into unrecognizable versions of themselves. But here's the first shocking secret: this transformation doesn't happen overnight. In fact, it begins much earlier, in an almost imperceptible way. Small signs go unnoticed by husbands, ignored by the women themselves, but they function as warnings of an imminent system collapse. Imagine discovering that the woman with whom you built a life, had children, and dreamed of growing old together, was actually unconsciously preparing to abandon everything. That every forced smile in recent years was hiding a growing revolt, a dissatisfaction fermenting silently until it became unbearable. The pain of realizing you were just a spectator of your own life being dismantled piece by piece, without even knowing it was happening. The cruelest part is that these women aren't villains. They don't wake up planning to destroy families. In fact, many of them are victims of a complex psychological process that combines biological, social, and emotional factors in such a powerful way that it becomes practically irresistible. Modern society has created the perfect trap for the female mind at 40. On one side, there is constant pressure to maintain youth and attractiveness. On the other, the relentless reality of time passing and leaving its marks. And in the middle of it all, a woman who sacrificed her individual dreams for her family, but who now questions if it was worth it. But there is a specific trigger that turns this latent dissatisfaction into destructive action. Something happens that finally makes the bomb explode. Can you imagine what it is? While men age and gain charm, being seen as more experienced and attractive, women face the opposite. Each new day brings the cruel reminder that their market value is decreasing. And when you combine this external pressure with hormonal changes that directly affect mood and reasoning ability, you have the perfect recipe for an emotional catastrophe. But the most disturbing aspect of this situation is how it spreads. Women going through this crisis become negative influencers for other women of the same age. They share their discoveries about freedom and personal fulfillment, planting seeds of dissatisfaction in relationships that until then were working. Social media has amplified this effect exponentially. Now, a 40-year-old woman doesn't even need to leave home to be bombarded with images of other women rediscovering life after divorce, traveling the world, dating younger men, living a supposed freedom she doesn't have. There is a specific type of woman more prone to this emotional explosion. Psychological and behavioral traits that function as warning signs. What might those traits be? The phenomenon is so predictable that specialists can identify behavioral patterns years before the crisis erupts. But the scariest part is discovering that seemingly positive factors, like dedication to family, capacity for sacrifice, and focus on others' well-being, can actually be ingredients of this emotional time bomb. The woman who spent 20 years putting everyone ahead of herself, who gave up personal dreams to be the perfect wife and mother, who built her entire identity around her family, is exactly the one most vulnerable to the explosion at 40. Because when the children grow up and the husband seems to take her presence for granted, she looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize who she has become. And here comes the first twist in this story. The problem isn't just with women. There is a vicious cycle where unconscious husbands actively contribute to creating the perfect conditions for this emotional crisis, without even realizing what they're doing. If you're following this analysis and starting to recognize patterns in your own life or in the lives of people close to you, don't miss the next chapters. We're going to dive even deeper into the psychological mechanisms behind this devastating transformation, and you'll discover secrets that can save relationships or, at the very least, help you understand what's really happening when a 40-year-old woman starts to change. If this content is useful to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow our complete analysis. Husbands are, most of the time, the last ones to notice. They continue their routines, come home from work expecting to find the same woman as always, but something fundamental has already changed. The transformation begins so subtly that it goes unnoticed even by the most attentive. A different comment here, a longer look in the mirror there, small changes in behavior that seem harmless. The most common trigger is not what most people imagine. It's not necessarily an affair or a major marital crisis. In fact, it can be something seemingly insignificant, a casual comment from a stranger about her appearance, an old photo that shows up on Facebook, or even seeing a former schoolmate who seems to have found herself after divorce. These small events work like sparks in a powder keg that has been building for years. The female mind at 40 is in a state of extreme vulnerability. Hormones are beginning to change, self-esteem is fragile, and there's a growing sense that time is running out. When this combines with the perception that her life is reduced only to the roles of mother and wife, the result can be explosive. The anger these women feel is overwhelming and often irrational. They look back and see years of unrecognized sacrifices, abandoned dreams, a version of themselves that was gradually erased in favor of the family's needs. This anger doesn't arise overnight. It fermented for decades, fueled by small frustrations, unmet expectations, and the feeling of invisibility that grows with each passing year. There is a specific behavioral pattern that makes certain women more vulnerable to this emotional explosion. They are usually the ones who were the perfect ones, the ones who never complained, always put family first, sacrificed personal ambitions without questioning. Ironically, their greatest qualities become their greatest vulnerabilities. These women built their identity entirely around caring for others. When the children grow up and become independent, when the husband seems to take her presence for granted, they look in the mirror and ask a devastating question: who am I besides being a mother and a wife? The answer to that question is terrifying for them. Often, there isn't a clear answer. Years of total dedication to the family resulted in the gradual erasure of their individuality. And at 40, with youth clearly in the rearview mirror, this realization becomes unbearable. The most prone psychological profile includes seemingly positive traits: high capacity for sacrifice, tendency toward perfectionism, excessive need for approval, and self-esteem based mainly on recognition from others. When that recognition decreases or becomes routine, the emotional foundation of these women collapses. Modern society has cruelly amplified this problem. Social media bombards these women with images of freedom and empowerment that seem unattainable in their current lives. They see other women their age traveling alone, starting new relationships, building late careers, and an inevitable comparison begins to corrode their satisfaction with their own lives. But here's something few realize: the role of husbands in this process is much greater than we imagine. Not out of malice, but out of emotional neglect that develops over the years. When a man stops courting his wife, when compliments become rare, when intimacy turns into obligation, he is inadvertently creating the perfect conditions for the midlife crisis. The typical man in this situation works hard, provides financially, is a good father, but completely forgets to continue being a boyfriend to his wife. He assumes that love and attraction are permanent, that they don't need to be constantly nurtured. This is a fatal mistake that directly contributes to the emotional time bomb that is about to explode. The first real turning point happens when these women start seeking external validation. It may begin innocently, with more care for their appearance, a return to the gym, new hobbies. But it quickly evolves into riskier behaviors, more intimate conversations with other men, constant reevaluation of life decisions, deep questioning about happiness in marriage. The most dangerous part is that this process creates a distortion of reality. The woman in crisis begins to rewrite the story of her marriage, focusing only on the negative aspects and minimizing all the positive that was built. Selective memories turn an imperfect but functional relationship into an emotional prison she feels she must escape. Divorced friends become especially toxic influences at this moment. They share edited stories of their new lives, omitting the hardships and highlighting only the positive aspects of separation. For a woman already in crisis, these narratives act like an irresistible call to freedom. The psychological transformation is so deep that those close to her begin to comment that she's no longer the same person. And in a way, it's true. The combination of hormonal changes, identity crisis, and social pressure creates a temporarily unbalanced version of the original personality. The most tragic aspect is that this phase could be navigated in a much healthier way if it were understood and faced with proper support. But most couples don't have the emotional tools needed to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. The result is an explosion that destroys not only the marriage but the entire family structure built over decades. The despair that precedes the final decision is palpable. It's the feeling of being trapped between two equally terrifying realities, staying in a life that feels like an emotional prison, or blowing everything up and facing the devastating consequences for the children and for herself. At this moment, the ability to think rationally becomes completely compromised, and irreversible decisions are made based purely on extreme emotions. The moment of the explosion is always preceded by a period of apparent calm that completely deceives the husband. She seems to have accepted the situation, smiles again, shows renewed interest in the family. But in reality, this happens because she has already made the decision mentally. The weight of uncertainty has lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the determination to end everything. During this phase of false tranquility, she is secretly preparing. It could be looking for apartments, consulting lawyers, or simply organizing in her mind how she will communicate her decision. The husband, relieved to see her apparently better, completely relaxes, not realizing he is witnessing the calm before the storm. The second most devastating twist is discovering that many of these women have already started emotional or even physical relationships before even communicating their decision to their husbands. What seemed like an impulsive decision was in fact carefully orchestrated over months. They tested the waters, made sure they had alternatives, before burning bridges for good. This behavior reveals something disturbing about female psychology in crisis: the need to have an emotional safety net before leaving the familiar. Unlike men, who often end relationships more directly, these women build bridges before crossing the river. It's an emotional survival strategy, but also a devastating betrayal for those left behind. The role of social media in this process is much more sinister than it appears. It's not just about superficial comparisons, but about a true collective brainwashing. Algorithms programmed to hold attention end up feeding these women with content that reinforces their dissatisfactions. Posts about rebirth after 40, it's never too late to start over, you deserve to be happy create an echo chamber that completely distorts reality. These platforms have become tools of emotional radicalization. A woman who enters questioning a few aspects of her life leaves convinced that she needs to destroy everything to be happy. The algorithm doesn't differentiate between healthy personal growth and emotional self-destructiveness, it simply delivers more of the same content that generates engagement. The influence of divorced friends reaches its peak during this phase. They become true evangelists of separation, sharing romanticized versions of their new lives. What they don't tell are the sleepless nights worrying about money, the real loneliness they feel, the devastating impact on the children, the struggles of rebuilding life from scratch in their 40s. There is also a psychological phenomenon known as validation by proxy. When a divorced woman manages to convince a married friend to follow the same path, it retroactively validates her own decisions. It's as if each new separation confirmed she made the right choice. That's why these influences are so persistent and persuasive. Biology also plays a crucial role that few recognize. The hormonal changes of perimenopause affect not only the body but profoundly alter the brain chemistry responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and emotional stability. What looks like a rational choice is often a decision made by a temporarily unbalanced brain. Declining estrogen levels directly affect serotonin, the neurotransmitter responsible for the sense of well-being and satisfaction. This explains why women who were naturally content with their lives suddenly feel deeply unhappy without an apparent reason. It's not fussiness or drama, it's a real chemical change that distorts the perception of reality. The exact moment of the explosion usually happens during a seemingly trivial argument. A conversation about household chores, vacation planning, or children's education suddenly escalates into a devastating statement: "I don't love you anymore," or "I want a divorce." The husband is completely lost, trying to understand how a normal conversation turned into the end of the marriage. The coldness with which this decision is communicated shocks everyone around. The woman who was always emotional and expressive suddenly becomes calculating and distant. She has already processed all the emotions internally for months, so when she finally verbalizes the decision, she seems strangely detached from the impact she is causing. The children become the cruelest victims of this explosion. They watch, confused and terrified, as the family structure they knew disintegrates before their eyes. The mother who always prioritized their well-being is suddenly prioritizing her own needs, often in a way that seems selfish and inexplicable to children. The most disturbing aspect is how these women manage to rationalize the impact on their children. They convince themselves that kids are resilient, that it's better to have separated and happy parents than together and unhappy, that they will understand when they grow up. These justifications serve to ease the guilt but do not correspond to the traumatic reality children experience. The emotional devastation spreads like ripples in a lake. It affects not only the nuclear family but grandparents, uncles, close friends, an entire network of relationships built over decades. Family gatherings become emotional minefields, traditions are abandoned, shared memories turn into sources of pain. The most tragic thing is realizing that many of these explosions could have been avoided with proper intervention in the early stages. But our society treats signs of marital crisis as taboo, something to be resolved in private or simply ignored until it's too late. By the time professional help is finally sought, the emotional damage is already done and the decision has already been made internally. What happens after the explosion is even more revealing than the process that led to it. In most cases, post-separation reality is brutally different from the fantasies that fueled the decision. The dreamed freedom turns into overwhelming loneliness, new relationships rarely live up to romanticized expectations, and financial independence becomes a logistical nightmare she hadn't adequately considered. Longitudinal studies show a consistent pattern. Between 60 to 70% of these women report significant regret within 2 to 3 years after separation. Not necessarily regret about ending the marriage, but about the way they conducted the process and the unforeseen consequences that arose. Real life didn't match the carefully curated images they saw on social media. Loneliness is the first reality check. After decades of sharing responsibilities, decisions, and even worries with a partner, being completely alone to deal with everything can be paralyzing. Small things that were once shared, from fixing a faucet to deciding where to spend Christmas, become insurmountable mountains that reveal how much she depended on the family structure she destroyed. The financial impact is devastating in ways she never imagined. Even women who worked during the marriage find that maintaining the same standard of living on a single income is impossible. The house must be sold, the children must change schools, family vacations become memories of the past. The financial independence that seemed so empowering in theory turns out to be a prison of limitations in practice. But the cruelest aspect is discovering that the relationship market for women over 40 is merciless. Men of the same age often seek younger women, while younger men are rarely interested in serious relationships with older women. The male attention she sought to validate her attractiveness becomes scarce, and when it does appear, often comes with superficial intentions. The relationships she manages to establish rarely have the depth and stability she abandoned. Single men in their 40s often have specific reasons for being single, traumas from previous relationships, commitments to careers, or simply a preference for freedom that makes serious relationships impossible. She finds herself competing not only with other women, but with decades of emotional baggage and established behavioral patterns. The impact on children proves to be much more lasting and severe than she had anticipated. Children who were once secure and confident become anxious and withdrawn. Grades plummet, friendships deteriorate, regressive behaviors appear. The guilt she tried to rationalize during the process becomes a constant companion when she sees the real consequences of her decisions on the people she loved most. Family therapists report a dramatic increase in children in therapy due to separations initiated by mothers in their 40s. These children often develop separation anxiety, depression, trust issues that extend into future relationships. The trauma of seeing the maternal figure, traditionally associated with stability and care, become the agent of family destruction leaves deep psychological scars. Relationships with extended family also deteriorate in unforeseen ways. In-laws she considered family suddenly become hostile strangers. Sisters-in-law who were her confidants become allies of the ex-husband. Family gatherings that were sources of joy turn into emotional battlefields where she feels judged and rejected. Here lies the most powerful lesson of this analysis. The problem is not with age, hormones, or society, although all these factors contribute. The real problem lies in how our culture treats aging, relationships, and personal fulfillment as incompatible concepts. We've created a toxic narrative suggesting that personal growth requires the destruction of existing structures. The true tragedy is that most marriages destroyed during this crisis could have been saved and even strengthened if both partners had understood what was really happening. The midlife crisis, when properly understood and navigated, can be an opportunity for renewal and deepening of the relationship, not a sign of its inevitable end. Couples who survive this phase often emerge with more mature, honest, and fulfilling relationships. They learn to rediscover each other, to nurture individuality within the partnership, to continue growing together instead of separating to grow. But this requires conscious work, honest communication, and above all, the understanding that crises are opportunities in disguise. For men, the lesson is clear: don't take your wife for granted. Keep courting her, valuing her, seeing her as the desirable woman you chose, not just as the mother of your children or the household manager. Emotional complacency is the greatest enemy of long-term relationships. A woman who feels desired, valued, and seen by her husband rarely seeks external validation in destructive ways. For women approaching this phase, the message is equally important: personal growth does not require family destruction. It is possible to rediscover your identity, pursue postponed dreams, and develop your individuality without blowing up the structures you built. In fact, doing so within a committed relationship often produces more satisfying and lasting results than starting from scratch. Society needs to stop romanticizing family destruction as a form of female empowerment. There is a fundamental difference between leaving genuinely toxic relationships and destroying functional families in pursuit of illusory happiness based on comparisons with carefully edited lives on social media. True emotional maturity at 40 does not lie in starting over from scratch, but in consciously working to transform what already exists into something even better. Long-term relationships don't happen by accident. They are built day after day, year after year, through conscious choices to love, value, and invest in the partner even when it's easier to give up. If you recognized familiar patterns in this analysis, don't let it be too late. Seek professional help, invest in your relationship, communicate your needs constructively instead of destructively. Remember that the neighbor's grass always looks greener until you realize it also needs watering, care, and maintenance. The difference is that you will have to do all that alone, without the solid foundation you already built.